Welcome to Dalhousie Medical School. I'm Dr. Jock Murray. I'd like to tell you the story of the history of Dalhousie Medical School. This is a particularly momentous year in the history of the medical school because of the establishment and coming to fruition of the Dalhousie Medicine New Brunswick. Before I start, I'd like to point out that there is a history of New Brunswick medicine which was written by Dr. Brent Stewart, a radiologist in New Brunswick in years past, who wrote the history of medicine, and also I'll talk a little about the important contribution to medical education in New Brunswick prior to the establishment of the new Dalhousie Medicine New Brunswick. But let's go back to the start, because the history of Dalhousie Medical School is now 142 years old, and I'd like to tell you the story of how this all came about. Dalhousie was founded in 1818 by a large bequest of money left by the Earl of Dalhousie, who had been a lieutenant governor in Nova Scotia. He had collected customs when he was here on things that passed over the border during the War of 1812. It was referred to as the Castine Fund, and when he was called back to Britain, he decided that what he should do with this money was establish a university based on the principles of Edinburgh. His castle that you see here is still there, and actually you can stay in this castle. It's just outside Edinburgh. So Dalhousie was initiated at that time, but it took some time before they actually brought in students. It required a few years before they hired Thomas McCullough, founder of the Pictou Academy, to come as the first president. And what you see here is a stone building that is now where City Hall is in Halifax on Grand Parade. And that's where the first classes at Dalhousie began. Now, there was not a medical school at that time. In fact, there was not a medical school in the Maritimes. But Dr. Charles Tupper, a physician in Amherst who became premier of the province, decided that there should be a medical school, and he campaigned for many years, both politically and when he was on the board of Dalhousie, he campaigned for a new medical school. Now, it took some years before he got agreement with that, and by the time he was then premier, a group of the physicians met and they began to discuss the idea. They met at a surgeon's house, and it's confusing sometimes to determine when the medical school started, because they called themselves the faculty when they had that first meeting, even though they hadn't been constituted. And they met on December 1867. They applied to Dalhousie, however, in January 1868. And at that time, after some discussion, the Board of Governors of Dalhousie, not very enthusiastically, decided that they would allow a new faculty of medicine in the university. And they said, the board does not feel justified in refusing the offer of the gentleman who proposed to form a medical faculty in connection with Dalhousie University, and the faculty being ready and desirous to receive students in the ensuing spring, the board saw no sufficient reason for postponing further action on the matter. And you can note the sort of reluctance. They said at the time they thought it was going to be very costly for the university to do this, and that actually turned out to be so. If you come into the Tupper building, what you'll notice is that there is a plaque on the wall, and it has the names of those original physicians, practitioners in the city, who got together in that meeting and constituted the first medical school. The first medical school teaching that began at that time did not have Charles Tupper as a faculty member because he was then the premier. But he did pass anatomy acts and other legislation to make it possible for a medical school. And that's why he's recognized by the name of the medical school in Halifax. The building is called the Sir Charles Tupper Medical Building. And as you come into the foyer, you see the bust of Sir Charles there. But the first dean was A.P. Reed. He was a very imaginative and visionary character who developed the concept of a healthcare system that looks very much like our current one back in the 19th century. The announcement was a handwritten announcement indicating that they would take in new students. Now, it's quite remarkable when you look at modern committees who sometimes have difficulty achieving what they set out to do and take a long time. If you remember, this group got together in December. They applied to Dalhousie to become a faculty. They assigned the various professors to the different courses. They designed the curriculum. They advertised for students. They took in the new class of students and they began teaching. And from that first meeting to the first class was 3 months. So that's a very rapid kind of committee achievement, I think. They were given one room for teaching in the Halifax or in the Dalhousie Medical College down in Grand Parade, and they were given the attic roof for dissection. They had to carry the bodies up a ladder through a trap door, and there was no ventilation and very poor lighting in that building. So it was very poor accommodations, but they did start the class, and this is the first class. There were 12 students who applied. Now, the idea of the medical school initially was to teach the first 2 years. That would allow a maritime student to get the first 2 years near home and then go off to Philadelphia or London or Edinburgh or somewhere else to do the last 2 years and achieve their medical degree. So the first few years, the idea was only to give them the first 2 years of training. And the first class that did graduate was only 5, because while they were still in medical school, the medical school decided they could actually give all 4 years. They had enough resources, enough clinical material. Many of the class still went on to Harvard or London or somewhere else to achieve their degree, but 5 stayed, completed the 4-year term, or 4 years at Dalhousie, and they were the first class. So the first class that graduated were 5 students. You had to do a thesis, and these are the theses that were done by those particular students. They had their clinical experience mostly at the Victoria General Hospital. At that time it was called the Provincial and City Hospital, later renamed after Queen Victoria. And they also had experience in dispensing medications and doing outpatients at the Halifax dispensary. So they had a 4-year course, well designed with a lot of clinical material, and they were really quite proud of their medical school based on Edinburgh. But within a few years, they felt they weren't funded well enough by government. That's an old story, isn't it? And they decided to separate from the university so they could apply separately for grants as an independent institution. While they were a faculty of Dalhousie, they couldn't apply separately for grants or funding. So they separated, and it was a peculiar arrangement. The new school, which was called the Halifax Medical College, was an independent organization, but it was attached in name with Dalhousie, who also then had a dean of medicine and an examining board. So after you had your 4 years at the Halifax Medical College, you applied to do your exams at Dalhousie and were given a medical degree from Dalhousie. Very peculiar arrangement, and we'll return to that later. When they set up as an independent organization, they also moved out of the old Halifax College of Dalhousie and into this building, which is on the corner of College and Carleton. So if you go out the Tupper main door and look to the right on that corner, that's where the Halifax Medical College was. And here's a picture of the building. In 1885, the medical school actually closed for 2 years over a fight between the faculty of the medical school and the board of the Victoria General Hospital, or the provincial, what was then the Provincial and City Hospital. The hospital had one position for a resident house surgeon, and 2 applied for it. One was a Dalhousie student from St. John, New Brunswick, and the other was a Halifax boy who went to McGill. So you had a Halifax lad going to medical school at McGill. You had a St. John, New Brunswick student going to Dalhousie. The faculty, of course, wanted their graduate from St. John to get this award, but the board of the hospital said they wanted a lad from Halifax. So the conclusion was, okay, we'll have them write an exam. And when they did, Goodwin from St. John made 80 on the exam, and Hawkins from McGill made 66. The board, however, of the hospital appointed Hawkins from McGill. The faculty of the medical school were outraged about this because their student did much better on the exam, but the board said, well, it was just to see if they were qualified. It wasn't about who was the highest. Well, the faculty were outraged at this, and they resigned from the hospital. So now the staff of the hospital had resigned. They left 2 physicians to take care of emergencies and the others. But the medical school then closed for 2 years because it didn't have a place to do its clinical teaching. So an odd event in the history of the school. They then reconstituted 2 years later and began teaching again. And here's an early picture of the students and the faculty and a picture of Halifax Medical College in the middle. And here's an early class, very dapper looking group. And you'll notice, and I'll return to this discussion, that in those early pictures of our medical school class, there's something very unusual in comparison to almost any other medical school, and that is that there were women in those classes. And you'll notice in the anatomy dissection lab here, there is a woman, and there are women standing on the steps as well. The story of women in medicine at Dalhousie is a very interesting one because most medical schools in Europe, in the United States, and Canada at the time would not allow women. And anytime women applied to medical school, they were always refused. But an interesting thing happened at a faculty meeting at Dalhousie in 1881. Spontaneously, no one had applied. There was no argument or fighting over this. The faculty passed a resolution indicating that they not only would allow women to come into medicine at Dalhousie, they encouraged them to apply. Now, we don't know the background, and I'm looking into the history of this now, of why that came about, because it's in contrast to virtually any medical school anywhere. Now, it took 9 years before the first woman applied, but when she did, that was Annie Hamilton, applied in 1889 and graduated in 1894. She took a year or so out in a medical school career to teach school to make enough money to come back. But the history of women in medicine is longer at Dalhousie than in many other medical schools. Some, like Harvard or Queen's in Canada, did not allow women until after World War II. And this is Annie Hamilton showing her. She became a very well-known and prominent missionary physician in Shanghai all her career, seldom returned home. And you see her in her Chinese dress on the left. That's the home in which she was born. It's since been torn down. And you see her when she had a rare return later in her life and career. And here's a medical school class, and you'll notice Annie Hamilton sitting in the second row, the first woman graduate at Dalhousie. But there is a book, and if you have a chance at a secondhand bookstore, you can pick up a little book about the history of women graduates at Dalhousie Medical School, written by Dr. MacLeod, Enid MacLeod, and it's a very interesting story of each of these women. Many of them became missionaries in China and India and other countries. There's a book about Florence Murray, who was one of those missionaries, and about a number of other missionaries. There are books written about their lives and their contributions. And that's the book by Enid Johnson MacLeod, who was a teacher in anatomy at Dalhousie and recorded the first 40 years of women graduates at Dalhousie. And that's a picture of the Halifax Medical College, the students standing on the steps, and you'll notice a number of women present in the class. And if you think puffed shoulders on dress and jackets is new, you'll notice that they have those in great prominence. And here's the graduating class in 1900, and a couple of illustrious people from that class. a young Ms. Brain married Dr. Reynolds, and they went off to the mining camps in Missouri and took care of in Montana, and took care of the miners for many years, and there's a book written about them. And their grandson recently was president of the American College of Physicians. And here are early pictures of anatomy of one of the rugby clubs from the medical school, a dissection lab, again with women present. One of the reasons that many medical schools obstructed any attempts of women to enter medicine was that they didn't think that women, it would be nice for them to learn the details of anatomy. That didn't seem to bother the Dalhousie faculty. And there's an interesting episode that occurred. One of their teachers of pharmacology was actually an apothecary from the Civil War who came to Halifax and taught the students. He always wanted to have the title doctor, but didn't, and the university felt that he didn't have the background that was adequate to assign him the degree of doctor. So the students, recognizing that at that period in which the school separated from the university, the school had the ability to give degrees. So they actually assigned and gave a degree. So this is actually given by the students, and this degree hangs in the current Victoria General Hospital wall, and his grave at Camp Hill Cemetery says Dr. Putner. They had a little ceremony, they had candles, they had a very wonderful presentation to Dr. Putner. And the other story I'll tell about that time, before there was a children's hospital, there was a small ward at the Victoria General Hospital for children. And one Christmas Eve, two of the interns at the hospital noticed that there was no Christmas tree on the children's ward. So they knew that Dalhousie had just moved to the Studley campus and decided, because there were new pine trees planted, they'd go up and chop down one of the university trees and bring it back for the children. But as they were walking up University Avenue, they noticed the city had planted new trees, so they chopped down one of those and took it back for the children. And you'll still notice on University Avenue the space between the trees. Now, the medical school was proud of its teaching. It had been training physicians for the maritime provinces. It had been training missionaries for the world, and had what they thought was a very good educational system, and they were very proud of its graduates. What happened around this time is that a concern about the quality of many medical schools in North America caused the Carnegie Foundation and the American Medical Association to send a school teacher by the name of Abraham Flexner to visit every single medical school in the United States and Canada and do a review of those medical schools. He did, and gave what was probably the most momentous medical report ever written, because it ended up closing a very large number of medical schools in the United States. He also visited Dalhousie. Now, he had an idea in his mind about what constituted a good medical school, and he arrived without an announcement early in the early hours of the morning on train, came to the medical school, asked a few questions of representatives at the time, and got back on the train at around 11 in the morning, and that was his review. And then he wrote what was a very critical review of Dalhousie. Not nearly as critical as many of the schools that later closed, but he said the calendar for the medical school at Halifax Medical College says first-class laboratory accommodation is provided for histology, bacteriology, and practical pathology, but his conclusion was one utterly wretched room is provided for all three. And he said there is no museum, he means an anatomy museum, worthy of the name, and no laboratory work in physiology or pharmacology. The laboratory sciences have been starved so that small dividends might be paid to the generally prosperous clinicians or practitioners. Now, they were outraged at this. They were outraged for a number of things. He was not there to actually see very much, and he wrote this very critical report. So they wrote a report responding to this. And they were also outraged that he was suggesting that the medical school was impoverished because they were collecting all the fees. And they not only were outraged about the fact that they weren't paid very much for their teaching, but in fact, for a couple of years, they actually gave up any pay so that they could construct a new pathology laboratory at the medical school. So they were quite upset. However, within a year, they made a number of changes. And one of those changes was to reunite with the university and again become a faculty. He said that arrangement of the medical school teaching independently and the university giving the degree was just so peculiar it shouldn't continue. And within a year, the Halifax Medical College ended, and they were again a faculty of the university. But the result of the Flexner report, 50% of American medical schools closed. No Canadian schools closed, but he was very critical of Laval and Manitoba and Queens and Dalhousie. He had kind words to say about Toronto and McGill. But within a very short period of time, the Carnegie and Rockefeller Foundations thought that these schools were actually worthy of increased funding to make them even better. And the first one to get funding was Dalhousie. When they became a faculty, they moved into the Forest Building, the large building that now houses the health professions. And so that, for many years, until 1968, became the medical school. And the teaching again continued at the Victoria General Hospital, but also at a number of other hospitals, including hospitals around the Maritimes. So the Aberdeen in New Glasgow and St. Elizabeth's in Prince Edward Island, St. John, all became teaching hospitals as well. Now World War I broke out, and Dalhousie applied to have what was called a stationary hospital, which is an odd term because actually the hospital, like a MASH unit, moved with the front. And it was under the command of a famous surgeon living in Nova Scotia by the name of John Stewart, who had been the surgical assistant to Lord Lister. And he was quite famous at the time, and a lot of people volunteered to serve under him. And that's a picture of the number 7 stationary hospital of Dalhousie when they lined up prior to sailing for Europe. And they served in France, and the first ones they took care of were German injured soldiers. But they did serve well, and they moved again with the front, particularly in France. And there's John Stewart sitting in the front row in the middle. And he was quite senior at the time that he commanded this, and he expected to retire as soon as he returned to Nova Scotia, because he was in his late 60s. Beloved of many and regarded as a wonderful, not only wonderful surgeon, great teacher, and very impressive leader. Here's a Christmas card from the Dalhousie Stationary Hospital, which was at the front in France. And if you come in the foyer of the Tupper building, you'll see the flag of the hospital, which is there, and a list of all of those who served. And these are those who served and those who died, and that plaque is also in the entrance of the medical school. Now, shortly after the hospital was formed, we had in Halifax the Halifax explosion. This is a rare photograph of the explosion and the smoke occurring. And it devastated the city, and immediately the medical students were recruited to assist the physicians. Many of the physicians, of course, were overseas, so there were only a small number of local physicians to care for the 2,000, well, there were 2,000 dead, but to care for the 9,000 that were seriously injured, and there were 25,000 people immediately homeless in this explosion. And this is the Emo that collided with the Mont Blanc. And so there was much to do, and you can imagine as a first-year medical student finding that within your first 3 months you're assisting surgeons to remove a leg or remove an eye or to do other major surgery or to give anesthetics. but the students were called upon. And there is a report of all of the medical students, where they served and how long. It was unusual that Camp Hill Hospital had just been built for the military in World War I and was empty. So one could never design a civil disaster that has an empty hospital, brand new, well-equipped, just waiting for the injured. Now, even though he planned to retire, he returned, and John Stewart was then asked to become the dean of the medical school. And it was a time of great activity. There was the recovery of Halifax after the explosion. There were all the reforms in medical education after Flexner, and there were a lot of medical facilities being built. So it was a very dynamic time. He was given the position of dean with no salary. Ambulatory teaching was always a prominent thing at Dalhousie. We were noted for teaching from the first year on in ambulatory settings with patients. They built a lot of buildings along University Avenue at the time. Grace Maternity was built, the pathology building, a lot of these buildings, the Clinical Research Center where the dean's office is at Dalhousie, all were built in these early days up until about 1922. That's the Clinical Research Center, which is now housing the Division of Medical Education, the Dean's Office, and many other aspects of the medical school. And here's an ambulatory setting for teaching in the early 1920s. That's the PATH building, which is still there. It's now the Clinical Trials building. And there's the newly built Clinical Research Center, and you see the building behind, that grand Victorian forest building. And that's the Grace Maternity Hospital built right beside it for the care of mothers and new infants. Camp Hill, after World War I, had large facilities, and they were then used for teaching as well. And this is what would then be a modern teaching laboratory for physiology. And here's the resident staff. They were beginning to teach residents to be specialists in the 1920s. And Dalhousie, which was a pioneer in continuing medical education, in 1922 started its first series of annual continuing medical education conferences. An early resident staff at the VG. Many of those became prominent physicians in the community and on the faculty. Another ambulatory setting. And here's a very studious group of students in one of the lab classes. That's in the Forest Building. Now, the Independent Medical College was abandoned when they became part of the university, and it later was torn down. And another current home built in its place. And here we have the staff getting larger and larger as the medical school expanded, taking more students. And this is the faculty in 1936. Now, in 1936, it was difficult for Maritimers to go to medical school because of the cost, and it was then the Depression, that there was an increased number of students coming from the United States. And large numbers of Jewish students, because they had difficulty getting into medical school in the U.S., but there was no problem or restriction in coming to medical school at Dalhousie. And there's, again, another laboratory at the time, and that's also in the Forest Building, as we have here. Chymographs being used in the physiology laboratory. Now, World War II then broke out, and the medical school then designed a rapid class. So at one point, we had two classes going at the same time, one of which would graduate early. And so in 1944, two classes graduated together, the normal class and the fast stream class. We later gave that early fast stream class a graduation 50 years later because they didn't actually get a graduation at the time, because as soon as they graduated, they tended to move overseas, we gave them 50 years later a graduation. Now, another event that occurred in Halifax at that time, 1944, was the development in Halifax of the Federation of Medical Women of Canada. And the inaugural meeting occurred there in 1944. And here's a group at the time. This is in the late 40s. And some, again, prominent department heads and faculty are seen when they were residents at the time. And this is what was then a modern operating scene, because a new Victoria General Hospital had been built at the time. And that's what was thought to be the ultimate modern hospital. And if you go in the Victoria General Hospital now, you'll still see those rounded nursing stations. And there's a very keen class overseeing a surgical operation. Now, we don't do that anymore because you can't really see very much. But at the time, you could observe through a glass in an amphitheater in the operating room what was going on in the operating room. And here we have in the late 50s the laboratory, and some of those students are still in practice. Chester Stewart was the dean at the time, and he had the idea of building a new medical school building. Now, we were coming up to the centennial of Canada, and each province was going to give a centennial project. His idea was that Nova Scotia would give a new medical school building as their centennial project. So again, when you come in the foyer of the Tupper building at Dalhousie, there's a plaque on the wall indicating that the building is the centennial project of Nova Scotia. And it was appropriate that it was called after Sir Charles Tupper, because he was a father of Confederation. It was his idea to have a Confederation of Canada. He argued for the medical school that became Dalhousie. So although he was never on the faculty, it's appropriate that he was recognized. And there's the construction stage of what would have eventually become the 15 floors. And that's the plaque that shows that it was the project of Nova Scotia. And the Queen Mother, Lester Pearson, Robert Stanfield. Beside the Queen Mother is Henry Hicks, president of Dalhousie. And there was a major conference on medical education with leaders from around the world at that time. And then we had a new medical school, the large White Tower. And a constellation of hospitals, a new children's hospital, later a new maternity hospital joined to it that constituted a large complex of medical institutions that related to the teaching of medicine. Now, of course, we're at an age in which we're expanding the whole concept of the medical school and its relationship to the Maritimes by the development of New Brunswick Medical School. And and Dalhousie Medicine, New Brunswick, will be a whole new history. And I hope that one of you may sometime be the historian for the developments that occur in that visionary project, which is so exciting for us. It's worthwhile remembering, however, that this is not the beginning of medical education in New Brunswick. We had postgraduate training going on over half a century before this. The Royal College, however, in 1969 indicated that all postgraduate training had to be in relation to a medical school. Before that, in St. John, they had a resident program which was independent. And at that time, the decision was either to stop training residents or to join in the resident training with the programs that were going on in Halifax, and they chose to do that. And so from 1969 on, there was an official relationship between postgraduate training in St. John and Halifax at Dalhousie. But other training was going on. Family medicine has a very wide development of postgraduate training in many of the institutions and communities around the Maritimes. resident programs have been expanding during that time, and we have a very experienced group of faculty in Fredericton and Moncton and St. John and Charlottetown. And these have been a very important part of the experience of medical education at Dalhousie. Discussions about a medical school in New Brunswick excuse me. Discussion about a medical school in New Brunswick is not a new one. In fact, it began perhaps a quarter of a century ago that the Brunswick governments began to contemplate the idea, but based on expense and resources, they usually decided not to proceed. But the idea had been planted and continued to rise again. And so we've seen now something that had been discussed for a quarter of a century coming to fruition, a very exciting time in the history of the medical school. So that has taken you on a 142-year cycle of the history of the medical school. And that touches on some of the aspects, I think, that were important. It's important for you to recognize medical school has been here for a long time. It has continued to develop and change, and it will continue to change in the future, and you will be part of that. One of the things about being a physician is that you will always be identified with the medical school that you graduated from, but you become part of that medical school the day you enter. So you are now part of the medical school, you're part of the profession and part of the tradition, and that began the day that you entered. So we're back in a full cycle to that first class. You're the current class, a very exciting time, not only for you, but for us. And this is a look again at that first group of students who started this all when they very bravely decided in 1868 that they would be part of a new project of medical education at Dalhousie, and you're now part of that ongoing story. Now, I hope you find that of some interest. We will be writing a book in the future about this and illustrating what we think is a very exciting story of medical education in the Maritimes. And you and your class will be part of this. If you have any questions about this, I would really like to hear from you. Any additional information, questions that you may have, or suggestions that you have. And you can always get me at jock.murray@dal.ca. Thank you very much for your attention.